The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Automated Vehicles Bill Lords, as amended in Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
Now.
We will begin with New Clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider other selected new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper. I call Wera Hobhouse to move New Clause 1.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have tabled 3 amendments which seek to strengthen the provisions made for data protection in the bill. Amendment New Clause 1 would require the Secretary of State to report to Parliament on the collection of personal data from automated vehicles within 1 year of the day on which the Act is passed and every year thereafter. This report must cover levels of compliance with data protection legislation within the automated motor industry, instances where the Secretary of State has made regulations under Section 42 (3) on this Act, and the impact of these regulations on personal data protection and any significant trends in the collection of personal data and whether further action is needed to regulate the personal data. For a sustained public confidence in automated vehicles and the data protection issues that arise, it is important we have this continued monitoring and reporting. With a new technology, it is inevitable that new issues will arise over time, particularly as AVs learn and change their behaviour accordingly. The reporting is necessary to keep the regulations on data protection under review as the technology develops. The government must give further assurances in the bill that people's personal data will be protected before this bill becomes law and commit to the annual reporting set out in this clause. This bill would also be strengthened by Amendment New Clause 2, which would require the Secretary of State to consult the Information Commissioner's Office before making regulations in relation to the provision of personal data relevant to automated vehicles. As I previously mentioned in reference to Amendment New Clause 1, which would maintain monitoring of the provisions made for data protections, New Clause 2 would make this monitoring and reporting process easier, as advice can be taken from the ICO rather than using parliamentary time. Again, this will install public confidence in the legislation, as the advice will come from and is an independent body. In order to operate, all automatic vehicles must be able to collect data, and much of this data will be personal. The information collected will help to make AVs safer as the system learn more about the road and others using it. With strengthening the process of how any changes to future protections are made, this will again assure the public that their personal data will be secure. Further assurances would be given by Amendment 8, which seeks to probe a number of concerns around data protection and ownership and seeks to prevent authorization of companies as self-driving entities unless robust data practices are in place. This amendment would ensure that a person may not be an authorized self-driving entity unless they meet the following requirements: that they have obtained a certificate of compliance with data protection legislation from the Information Commissioner's Office for their policy in regard to the handling of personal data, that their policy in regard to this handling of personal data clearly outlines who has ownership of any personal data collected, including after the ownership of a vehicle has ended, and also that they are signatory to an industry code of conduct under UK GDPR.
Will the Honourable Lady give way?
I'm happy to give way.
I'd be very interested if you could just explain why it is she feels, with regard to this latter clause, what it is that, what feedback she's had or evidence she has had to think that the safety regulation system that's put in place will be inadequate to handle the concerns she raises.
I thank him for this, his intervention. In second reading, I think I was very positive about the introduction of the bill, and I see it as, the bright new future. But we should we should be careful of making sure that we're taking people with us, and therefore that, as I said, it is basically just making sure that people feel confident that really their personal data is handled in the most secure possible way. And that's why we have tabled those amendments, just as an assurance of the public that really government and everybody involved in this bright new future will really take very, very a careful look at all data protection measures.
I mean, given that this bill has had a remarkably untravelled passage through both houses to date, and that both houses are informed by enormous amounts of information from relevant parties and from their constituents, is there any reason, I think what she's saying is she has no reason to think, apart from a general worry about consent, that what she's talking about will be necessary, because she's got no reason to think that the regulator will not be able to take this stuff into account when they come to review.
Again, for that information, we are not intervention. We are not going to push this amendment to a vote. I just will want to make sure that the government really makes sure that all necessary and possible protections are being put in place. And yes, this has been debated several times, but as we know, this is looking into the future, and who knows what the future holds. We know about the worries that people have increasingly about their personal data, and that sometimes regulations aren't as robust as possible. It is basically a plea to the government to make sure that really all possible assurances are in place. Madam Deputy Speaker, there will inevitably be huge overlap between personal and commercial data with the rollout of automated vehicles. Personal data should be ring-fenced and access restricted, so it can only be used by the relevant parties in a pseudonymized form. We must consider questions like how will insurance companies be able to access data? For example, could insurance companies track someone's movement in an AV to raise insurance premiums? If a person is a regular visitor to hospitals or mental health clinics, this data would be attractive for insurance companies. And I think this is also an answer to his questions. You know, data sharing can still be quite not so protected as some people may wish. And I think all of what we have put in as amendments are there to assure the public. In absence of this protection, this amendment gives different parties may different parties be able to share data in an unregulated way. We have to ensure this bill does not lead to marketisation of people's data. I am also concerned that the government have not ensured adequate protections for disabled people in this bill, but this is not an amendment that I've put down. Alongside the provisions set out in my amendments for New Clause 1 for continued reporting on data protection from the Minister, the establishment of an advisory council set out in Amendment New Clause 3 would give disabled people assurance that if access issues do arise, they must be consulted. This bill takes a first step towards the creation of a framework within which automated vehicles can operate, and amendments New Clause 1 and 2 will ensure strong data protection are in place from its beginning. But as I said in second reading, I'm otherwise very supportive of the bill. It is something which we need to consider as the future, and I'm glad that the government is putting this bill forward. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Report on use of personal data in relation to automated vehicles.
The question is that New Clause 1 be read a second time. Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I, in support of the Liberal Democrats' New Clause 1 and also Labour's New Clause 3, which is essentially a clause, a new clause that we tabled at committee stage as well. But in moving Amendments 6 and 7 in my name and those of Plaid Cymru colleagues as I do, and I won't detain the House too long. It's clear there's broad agreement on the wider principles of the bill and the implications of details within, notwithstanding the amendments, of course, on the amendment paper. But as a member of the Transport Select Committee, it's been clear for some time that this framework legislation is required, and by and large the government have done a good job with it, and the sector largely content and no real opposition. And a decent job, okay, I'll change that to decent job. The Minister was too grateful for that there. And no real opposition in this place to the vast majority of the bill. With that being said, I must return to the issues around Clause 50 of the bill as it stands, which allows the Secretary of State the power to legislate on devolved matters. Now, that may well not be the intention of the bill, but the possibility obviously remains a concern. I am grateful to the Minister for meeting me on the problems with Clause 50. The fact that in the end the meeting came after the committee stage had concluded was disappointing, but was a reflection of the wild agreement and consent on all sides for the vast majority of this bill, resulting in an extremely swift conclusion to the Bill Committee. I also know that the Scottish Government and its ministers and officials have been engaged with, and its ministers and officials on Clause 50 and its implications for devolution and the proper remit of both governments have been discussed on at least 2 occasions, and I think more. But at committee, the Minister was forthcoming about discussing matters further with the Scottish Government, and I thank him for it, and I believe those discussions have taken place. As regards my Amendment 7 on consultation, it would be helpful if the Minister were to give a commitment here on the floor of the House and on the record that the Scottish Government and Welsh Government will be consulted fully before the relevant powers in Clause 50 were to be used by the Secretary of State. And that being the case, it would make no sense for the Government not just to accept Amendment 7, because that is all that Amendment 7 seeks to do. But the fact remains, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it would be infinitely preferable to have a statutory basis for the changes the UK Government proposed to make, one which respects and acknowledges the existing legal framework that exists under devolution. At committee, the Minister maintained the line that legal advice he and his Government had received indicated that these matters are all reserved, but the Scottish Government are clear that their similar advice indicates that these matters are devolved. My amendment would simply reflect the legal position as understood by the Scottish Government and outlined by the Cabinet Secretary for Transport at the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee of the Scottish Parliament last month, when she said, things that relate to offences under devolved legislation and offences that would be part of devolved areas, these are the areas that the provision would allow the UK Government to legislate on or make provision for in the future. We think it's a genuine issue of concern. In the same session, George Henry, the Operational Manager for Road Safety Policy and Education at Transport Scotland, said, I will just try to provide an explanation or an example. There will be devolved legislation that has been brought in either by roads authorities or even through the Scottish Parliament that Clause 50 allows the Secretary of State to change. That is the reason why we are not supportive of that. This Parliament could make a decision, this Parliament being the Scottish Parliament, could make a decision to implement a measure for good reasons, such as a low emission zone in that area, that could potentially be changed through Clause 50. Whether that's the intention or not, it does give the Secretary of State the power to do that. I hope it's clear to the Government, the UK Government, that it's not an issue of, as we are so often falsely accused of, Madam Deputy Speaker, of confected conflict. There is clearly a desire to make this legislation work, but equally we need this bill to work for everyone, including the devolved administrations. And as I highlighted at committee stage, if the Government's objective here is to ensure complete alignment between the Scottish and English traffic laws, that ship sailed a long time ago. We have a different speed limit regime, different drink driving laws, different approach to road traffic regulation in general. Wales too has indicated different priorities to England, with at least initially rolling out a national 20 mph speed limit. Clearly, there should be consistency across Ireland where appropriate about the basic framework under which automated vehicles will operate. And the devolved administrations have worked with their UK counterparts to make that happen, but that cannot be allowed to undermine the devolved position with regards to enforcement of the law, where this bill will affect devolved law. The Minister, again, has been very forthcoming here with me and in committee, and his commitment to constructive discussion with devolved administrations, and I welcome that again. But in around 6 months or so, we're expecting, with the greatest respect to the Minister, expecting a likely change of government, and the Minister will likely no longer be there. Whatever pledges or commitments have been made cannot bind his successors. So what is needed is a commitment in legislation that would need an act with this place to amend or scrap. And my Amendment 6 would ensure that where devolved competencies like those referred to in Clause 50 are at stake, those devolved parliaments are guaranteed their role as the providers or otherwise of legislative consent for this Parliament to legislate on their behalf, as is as is the accepted norm for devolved matters under the Seoul Convention for nearly 25 years now. Amendment 7 would in essence codify the pledges made by the Minister at committee stage about consulting the Scottish Government, and of course that is good, and I wait to hear the Minister's response to these amendments, but I believe a better solution with respect to devolution is through Amendment 6, which would require a legislative consent motion passed by the Scottish Parliament and indeed the Welsh Senate before a UK Minister could act rather than just a consultation. I don't think this is particularly controversial, and there are such disparate views from the legal advisers about where the line of devolved powers actually lies. Surely the UK Government, as a self-proclaimed champion of devolution, would be happy to codify exactly where that line lies and guarantee the Scottish Government and Parliament of whatever political hue the right to determine their own laws and regulations around automated vehicles now and in the future. So I wait to see what representations the Minister makes in his remarks before I decide whether or not we push Amendment 6 or indeed 7 to the vote. And on that I shall sit down.
Thank you. Shadow Minister Bill Esterson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've tabled 4 amendments at this stage of proceedings to build on the work at committee. And the context for the amendments is that the AV bill follows 4 years' work by the Law Commission, which included 3 public consultations. And the Commission's recommendations represent one of the most thorough pieces of work they have ever carried out. The bill builds on and provides further clarity to the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act AVA 2018, which originally set out the insurance framework for automated vehicles. It was the first piece of legislation to set out an insurance framework for the operation of automated vehicles. The Transport Committee published a report on self-driving vehicles in 2023, with its recommendations including a new legal framework through primary legislation. Developing automated vehicles has a number of potential benefits, and after losing our place as the leaders in the development of the technology, this bill can play its part in recovering Britain's international position and establishing one of the most robust frameworks for AVs in the world. So let's remind ourselves of some of the potential benefits. AVs could create a market worth £42 billion by 2035 and 38,000 new jobs. AVs have the potential to make roads safer, including for pedestrians and cyclists, by removing the human error that causes 88% of road traffic accident incidents. Research from the SMMT suggests that if automated vehicles are deployed in substantial numbers, 3,900 lives could be saved and 60,000 serious incidents prevented up to 2040. Better road safety means significant savings to the NHS. Research from AXA shows that in 2022, road traffic incidents cost the economy £42 billion, of which £2.3 billion was a direct cost to the NHS in medical treatment and ambulance services. AVs can help improve connectivity in areas where our public transport is failing passengers. Such an improvement needs to be alongside long overdue improvements in bus services rather than seen in isolation, of course. And better access to transport is important for a great many people, including in rural areas, for older people and for disabled people. An Age UK study found that driving remains the most common form of transport for older people. Most United States, Germany and France are all moving forward with their own AV frameworks. So it would be a mistake for the UK to fall further behind in an industry that could be worth £750 billion globally by 2035. Now, the UK is already running numerous automated vehicle programmes in the UK, in this country, including from Wave, Oxa and Starship. So let's consider where we are with the legislation in front of us and how we might build on the existing bill. So our 4 amendments at report stage cover the following issues. The establishment of an advisory council, the accessibility format required of automated vehicles if used as public transport, requirement for a publication of a list of data required to be supplied, removing the need for people injured by an automated vehicle to prove that the vehicle was driving itself if they make a legal claim for compensation. So starting with new clause 3, the Minister at committee said this multiple times, in fact, that he is in agreement over the need for proper consultation, and he insisted the government will consult properly. However, there appears to be something of a gap between the government's stated commitment to consultation and what is happening in practice. For example, government guidelines on minimum engagement for AV trials does not currently specify that disabled people's organisations need to be consulted. So if the Minister agrees with me on the importance of consultation, why is it that this is not stated on the face of the bill? We've also seen the impact of deindustrialisation. That's probably quite a good place to be.
Remarkably weak criticism, if I may say. I mean, this is a bill that as he acknowledges, has been developed, I say with a degree of ownership, but over a considerable period of time, with enormous amounts of input from involved parties. It is of obviously direct relevance to older people, people with difficulty with mobility, people with disabilities. The suggestion that somehow the government has neglected, by implication, those constituencies, I think is wholly mistaken.
I'll give him the credit for his role in getting the bill to this stage. And this is a bill which very largely has very strong support across the aisle and across society. He's quite right about that, and I think it does set the framework. But there are concerns in it, and this is one of them. And I will further develop the evidence base for what I've just been saying, Madam Deputy Speaker. But before I do that, I'm going to move on to the impact of deindustrialisation, the legacy it had of inequality, which has been sown into the fabric of our country. The failure to work with trade unions meant that the voice of working people was ignored. Communities across the country are still paying the price for the reckless approach taken. The bill does not address directly the potential impact on jobs from the introduction of automated vehicles. And automatic vehicles must be used for public good, and that must include the future for jobs. As much of the detail will be addressed through secondary legislation, it is therefore essential that unions and other stakeholders are included, not least to ensure a jobs transition. So, can I ask the Minister just to clarify once and for all in his response that he and the government will commit to consulting with trade unions throughout the rollout of automated vehicles to avoid repeating the mistakes over and over again that we saw with deindustrialisation. Our proposal for a council also includes a wider scope of groups representing people with disabilities, pedestrians, cyclists, emergency services, road safety experts, highway authorities, public transport services, manufacturers, drivers and insurance providers. Now, coming to the comments of the Honourable Member who intervened on me, Transport for All have highlighted that there is still no requirement in the bill for disabled people to be consulted or involved in developing the legislation, which will be crucial because of how much of the detail will be finalised through secondary legislation. And Transport for All have warned that without disabled people being consulted, and for this to be in statute, inaccessibility could become woven into the fabric of this new mode of transport before it even hits the road. Those are their words. So I'll ask the Minister to tell us what discussions he's had with Transport for All to address these concerns and how it is he proposes to combat the risks that they have outlined. And moving on to New Clause 4, consistent with the approach we've suggested in New Clause 3, New Clause 4 mirrors the existing provisions in the Equality Act 2010 relating to the provision of information in accessible formats to bus passengers and applies them to automated passenger services, bringing the AV bill into line with the 2017 Bus Services Act. The question for the Minister is, if it's in the Bus Services Act, why isn't it in the AV bill? The same points apply around consultation with disability groups for New Clauses 3 and 4. The Law Commission's report repeatedly stressed the importance of co-production with disabled people and recommended that an Accessibility Advisory Council should be established. So it does seem odd that the government's accepted many parts of the Law Commission report, but not this one. Turning to New Clause 5 and data sharing, the Minister at committee stage recognised the significance of the availability of data to investigators and insurance companies. So how does he plan to ensure that this availability will be in place without the requirement for data sharing being on the face of the bill? In committee, he recognised this significance, and I know it is a concern for the industry. He said that safety data will be collected by the vehicle, monitored by the operator and scrutinised by the government. Can you explain how the approach he's outlined will address the intricacies in regard to insurance access and dispute resolution? How will the government's approach avoid potential disputes between vehicle operators and manufacturers? His response to committee was limited to data sharing in respect of safety concerns. For the successful growth of this emerging market, competitive market conditions are needed, and therefore in-vehicle data cannot be restricted to vehicle manufacturers or withheld in real time to other market players. Now, that's an issue that was recognised by the Competition and Markets Authority as part of the guidance on motor vehicle agreements published in June 2023 to accompany the motor vehicle block exemption order of that year. The guidance states, in particular, the advent of connected vehicles places suppliers of motor vehicles in a privileged position, enabling them to access and use vehicle information in a way which may restrict competition between them, including their authorised networks, and independent operators. This bill is intended to allow the UK to be world leaders in automated vehicles. However, our international competitors are making strides ahead of the UK with comprehensive consultations to prevent anti-competitive practices from vehicle manufacturers and ongoing policy development. For example, the EU has extensively consulted on this broader issue as part of the regulation of data under the proposed EU Data Act. Can the Minister therefore address the concerns that are outlined in New Clause 5 in his response? And that brings me then to New Clause 6. A victim involved in a collision with an automated vehicle currently has to prove whether the vehicle was in self-driving mode at the point of collision. So can the Minister explain how he can guarantee that victims will be compensated when the burden of proof is always on the claimant in a legal claim, and neither the AV Bill or the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act 2018 changes that? Can he provide absolute clarity on whether this is the case? And if not, how costly and lengthy legal disputes over insurance will be avoided? Our 4 amendments are designed to clarify matters, Mr Deputy Speaker, and build on the framework of the bill, which we support, and I look forward to the responses from the Minister to my questions on each of our amendments.
Minister.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to thank the parties opposite for their broadly positive approach throughout this legislation in Bill Committee and the second reading. And there's clear consensus across the House that we embrace this new technology for all the opportunities that were set out by the member opposite. And I also want to thank my predecessor in this role, the member for Hereford and South Herefordshire, who, as mentioned earlier, helped steer the legislation through to this place and is clearly still paying a great interest in it, and I very much welcome that. I will be brief in my comments. Of the different, all the amendments apart from one were actually raised in identical form in Bill Committee, and my comments aren't going to change massively from the comments I made then. And by and large, just one broad overview, as we agree with the objectives of the various amendments, we just don't think that they're necessary, and in a couple of cases we think they're inappropriate. So on the taking New Clause 1, 2, 5 and 8, New Clauses 1, New Clauses 2, New Clauses 5 and Amendment 8, data protection clearly is very, very important. Some of the government absolutely supports that. But these amendments, these 4 amendments on it, are simply largely duplicate things that are already either in the bill or in other external legislation. So this government takes protection of personal data very, very seriously, and it's an important issue and requires careful consideration. And this bill does not seek to replace or change existing legislation on personal data protection, nor does it enable to contravene this legislation. It is not a bill about data protection. Any changes to data protection legislation are beyond the scope of this bill. It's the role of the Information Commissioner's Office to regulate on data protection issues. And the ICO has an existing obligation to report annually to Parliament on the Commissioner's activities. Any report by the Department for Transport, such as that required by the proposed amendment NC1, would risk duplicating this work. The Department of Transport is also not the data controller for information collected by regulated bodies, which means reporting would be inappropriate for us. The purpose of this bill is to create a comprehensive and effective safety framework for self-driving vehicles. The sharing of information may be necessary in order to achieve this. Public safety and security must come first. And any regulations made under the powers in this bill that permit further sharing or use of information will be developed in discussion with stakeholders, subject to consultation, and would then be laid in the House before coming to force. This provides multiple opportunities for input to and scrutiny of the proposals. Regulations will also be subject to a data protection impact assessment. And the Secretary of State already has a duty under Article 36, subsection 4 of the UK General Data Protection Regulations to consult the ICO on proposals for legislative measures. And so Amendment NC2 therefore duplicates an existing requirement that's already in law. Now, turning to Amendment NC5, this is unnecessary because all information-related regulations made under the powers in this bill will already be subject to consultation under the requirements of Clause 97. Clause 14 specifically requires that regulations which require information to be shared by an ASD or licensed operator must specify the purpose for which that data is to be shared. It would be unnecessary and onerous to duplicate these publication and consultation requirements with this amendment. Now, turning to Amendment 8, the protection of personal data will be considered alongside the detailed development of authorisation requirements. These requirements will be set out in secondary legislation and will be subject to consultation and impact assessment. So there will be consultation on this. Amendment 8 would place an additional burden on industry over and above that required by existing data protection legislation, such as that covers the data on our mobile phones. At present, a certificate of compliance is not mandatory under GDPR. In addition, the schemes referred to in the amendments are industry-led and therefore not within the control of government. There is therefore a risk that they would not achieve the intended result. On new clause 3, the member for Sefton Central talked at length about the inadequacies of government consultation, but as my honourable friend from Hereford and South Herefordshire said, throughout this process there has been incredibly extensive consultation, and we set out, I count 5 different ways that there will be consultation or engagement going forward. Some of the law commission has been, the law commissions of England, Wales and Scotland have been looking at this for 4 years and consulting throughout that process. The Secretary of State for Transport, who joins us here now, and myself had a roundtable group with a whole range of road user groups, including groups representing disabled people, about the impact of the legislation. And I will also be meeting disabled groups once the legislation moves through this House to consider some of the issues. And we recognise that engagement is incredibly important with all different groups, including the devolved administrations. And this bill provides new powers for technical safety requirements to be set out in statutory guidance and secondary regulation. And these requirements will be subject to consultation with stakeholders, including, but not limited to, the stakeholders identified in Clause 2, subsection 4. Now, following the bill's passage through the House of Lords, we now have included a statutory requirement to consult on the 3 groups with the most direct interest when developing the Statement of Safety Principles. And these are road safety groups, road user groups, and the self-driving vehicle industry. It's not a comprehensive list of those likely to be consulted, but it shows the breadth of the consultation we'll be doing. Once in place, the safety requirements for authorisation, licensing and in-use regulation will be monitored and enforced by the Department for Transport and its motoring agencies on behalf of the Secretary of State. The work of the Department and its agencies will be subject to scrutiny in line with all public bodies. Now, in addition to this, the Department's self-driving vehicle safety assurance work has an expert advisory panel. It already exists. It's already been consulted on to provide advice and challenge. The panel includes representatives from industry, academia and indeed road safety groups. We have given a commitment to a non-statutory commitment to an accessibility advisory panel. That is already, we've already given that commitment. The bill establishes a new independent no-blame instant investigation capability which will ensure we are effectively learning from incidents that involve self-driving vehicles. And finally, the Honourable Member will be reassured to see that Clause 38 already creates a general monitoring duty requiring the Secretary of State to publish an annual report on the performance of self-driving vehicles. Now, I hope all these different engagements that are set out there, that I've just set out, demonstrate that the Government shares the Honourable Member's view that scrutiny of implementation and learning from experience are of vital importance. All those engagements, future engagements, are already there, and that's why I think we believe that new Clause 3 is not necessary. On new Clause 4 about accessibility, clearly this is an incredibly important issue. Indeed, as I've made previously, and indeed the Secretary of State has made clear previously, that actually accessibility is one of the strong arguments for legislating for self-driving cars. There are many disabled people, in particular partially sighted or blind people, where self-driving cars could be incredibly impactful on their quality of life. Now, I thank the Honourable Member for his amendment for a new clause, but this replicates existing powers held by the Secretary of State regarding the provision of accessible travel information for buses to automated passenger services. Automated passenger services provide a great opportunity to make travel more accessible and inclusive. We already have power under the bill to mandate that information be provided to users in accessible formats through the permit conditions. This is a more flexible tool than the regulations. Now, conditions attached to individual permits can be adapted to fit a wide variety of different services. Some services may include alternatives to the provision of accessible format information, for example, including a member of staff in the vehicle that can focus entirely on helping passengers and providing that information. In addition, the bill expressly requires the appropriate national authority to consider accessibility in decisions to grant permits. This ensures that accessibility considerations are built into the services from the start. This enables innovation to come forward in this nascent sector and operators to consider the best way for their services to be accessible and inclusive. Now, finally, licensing and franchising authorities will also be able to steer requirements about accessible information formats. They can champion local needs through their role in providing consent for granting permits. As a result, we do not think that new Clause 4 is necessary. On new Clause 6, this amendment extends insurance first instance liability for incidents involving automated vehicles to all circumstances, even when an individual is driving it. The compulsory insurance regime in the Automated Electric Vehicles Act 2018, AEVA, was created to ensure that victims of incidents caused by automated vehicles received prompt compensation. The AV Bill amends AEVA to ensure it applies to authorised automated vehicles. However, there's no change to the principle that insurance first liability only applies when the self-driving feature is switched on. The proposed amendment will create an unnecessary discrepancy in insurer liabilities for manual driving, depending on whether the vehicle has a self-driving feature or not. And I therefore ask the Honourable Member to withdraw the amendment. Now, finally, coming to the clauses from the Scottish National Party on the amendments on Clause 50. We do consider that the user in charge immunity is a reserved matter. Indeed, the immunity will predominantly affect the application of reserved traffic offences, as the Honourable Member recognised. There is a limited range of devolved legislation in this area, and the immunity will have only minor incidental impact on this legislation. And just to make absolutely clear, and we did meet to talk about it, and we discussed it at the Bill Committee, that this is not about what the traffic regulations are in Scotland, whether what the speed limit is, whether it's an offence to break the speed limit or drive in a bus lane. It's about whether the liability rests on the driver or on the software company, ASDI, in a self-driving car. So it has no impact on the direct legislation in Scotland. And more generally, we think that public understanding and confidence will be key to realising the benefits of self-driving vehicles. It's vital that we have clarity and consistency across Great Britain about how these vehicles can be used and what individuals' responsibilities are. And this was the first recommendation by the Scottish Law Commission and the Law Commission of England and Wales in their joint report. They stated they did not think the public would be able to understand different or partial immunities based on distinctions between devolved and reserved laws. And the power in Clause 50 is necessary to ensure clarity and consistency in the immunities application. As the Honourable Member acknowledged, I've met him to talk about it. I've met the Cabinet Secretary for Transport in the Scottish Government to talk about it, and I gave an assurance letter afterwards, and I repeat what I mentioned in that letter, that I can assure you that where we propose to use the regulation-making power in Clause 50, we will always consult with the Scottish Government, and we will do so with other devolved administrations. Thank you.
I understand that the Honourable Lady wishes to withdraw new clause 1. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is it your pleasure that new clause 1 be withdrawn?
Aye.
New clause 1 by leave withdrawn. We'll leave the House. I shall put a single question on Government Amendments 1 and 2. The question is that Government Amendments 1 and 2 be made. As many of that opinion say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. Ayes have it. Amendment 6 was selected for a separate decision. Mr Newlands, do you wish to move formally?
Final sentence of the Minister, I got the assurance that I require, so I will withdraw the amendment.
So not moved. Leave the House. I shall put a single question on Government Amendments 3 to 5. The question is that Government Amendments 3 to 5 be made. As many of that opinion say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. The ayes have it.